with a truly exceptional panel, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I want to warn everybody and our panelists, the first class session here at Hofstra is just ending now, so we will have some students coming in during the panel. So we'll just ask them to get seated quietly. So my name is Mark Lukasiewicz. I'm Dean of the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication here at Hofstra. But before that was for a long time at NBC News and ABC News. And I'm delighted to dip my hat back into the journalism world with some of my friends and colleagues here. Let me introduce the panel, starting on the far end and working my way back. At the other end of the panel is Dr. Kara Alaimo. Dr. Alaimo is Associate Professor of Communications at Fairleigh Dickinson University. She was at Hofstra not too long ago in my school, and she was a spokesperson for the U.S. Department of Treasury in the second half of the first Obama term, a time that was fraught with financial crisis around the world, and was very involved in communicating about that. Next to Dr. Alaimo is Karen Finney. Karen was a spokesperson, the spokesperson and director of communications for the Democratic National Committee for many years during the Obama campaign in the early period of that presidency, a longtime Democratic strategist and a commentator on both CNN and MSNBC, and a political analyst. Next to her, Ann Compton, I did it backwards, I'm so sorry, Ann, wasn't looking down the table. Ann Compton, truly wonderful journalist and legendary White House correspondent, served for many decades in the White House, covering, I believe I've got it right, 7 presidencies? 7 presidencies?
7 presidents,
7 presidencies.
Post-Watergate, pre-Trump.
All the way. So gives us a fantastic perspective of covering different presidencies at different times. And finally, John Harwood next to me, who another longtime Washington journalist, CNBC's chief Washington correspondent for many, many years, CNN White House correspondent more recently, New York Times reporter, and analyst of all things in Washington. So welcome to the panel. I want to start, let's just get going on some of the most important topics, and let's talk about race. So Ann, 64 days into the Obama presidency, his second press conference, Barack Obama calls on you, and you started this way. You said, "Mr. President, could I ask you about race?" And he said you could, and you did, but I gather there was a reaction back in the newsroom from your fellow journalists when you asked that question.
I asked President Obama so early in his administration, because race had been such an element of his whole presentation, his race, his expectations, that hope and change. I said, "Mr. President, have you ever made a decision in your first 60 days in office which you felt race was a factor, either in how you decided what you did or what the effects of your policies would be?" And his answer was basically, no. My job, remember the crisis in the economy, we were literally falling off a cliff. He said, my focus is on the economy, improving it for everyone, black, brown, and white. And it was a good answer, and it stayed away from anything terribly controversial. But when I got back downstairs from the East Room to the White House press room, a couple of black reporters were very, very upset. First of all, thinking that a question about race should have come from a black reporter, and there were several in the session. But they also seemed to take objection to the fact that minorities were unusually, disproportionately affected by this incredible economic collapse. And they should get the special treatment that they need, especially from a black president. And one black commentator on television actually called my question stupid. And ABC promptly put her on the air to talk about her point of view. But I do think that the coverage of his racial factor was very well covered on that first panel. He was very much a creation of elite schools, corporate, background through all the way through law school, and the product of a white mother an absent black father and raised by loving white grandparents. And he was able to bring to the table both the whole spectrum of racial understanding and sympathies.
So, Karen, you were confronting these questions from the opposite side of the fence as a spokesperson, as an advocate for the president, for the party. And you've talked about how, in your position as a woman of color, talking about this first Black American president, anytime you made any reference to the president's identity, you were accused of playing the race card, and that newsrooms didn't really understand how to deal with this phenomenon. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I got to a point where if you said anything about race, the right wing would accuse you of race baiting. Even if, even when we were talking about, for example, Trayvon Martin, which was about race, by the way. But I want to just build off of something that Ann said to dig into this. I think it's important to remember, because I also happen to be mixed race. My mother is white, my father was African American. And it's not just that he went to elite schools and had white grandparents. It's that one of the things you learn when you're biracial is how to code switch. And you also have a life on two sides of the color line. So you understand that when you talk about the economy, poor white people are just as impacted as poor Black people or poor Latinos or AAPI Americans. And that was the gift that he brought, was that ability to talk about the way in which issues really can transcend. At the same time, I think there was an intentionality around, as the first Black president, I think he was also very aware of the fact that, I remember, we used to joke, right? People were afraid he was going to show up and paint the White House black, which is a line from a rap song, right? That, instead of understanding that his lived experience, which I think is the way we talk about it now, gave him insight into, of course he understood that dealing with the economy, there are disproportionate impacts on African Americans and other people of color, but also he understood that there were plenty of poor white people too who were being impacted. But that just doesn't tend to be the way we have that kind of conversation. And I thought the way I remember when Ann asked that question, and I thought it was a very honest way and very just straightforward question. And I think part of what we saw throughout his presidency was and this is still unfortunately largely the case, predominantly white male newsrooms, predominantly white male editors, news directors, the people who make decisions about what is news, how the news is going to be covered, were white men who didn't know what to do with this guy. And so I think one of the things I think was positive throughout the Obama years is, and I think it sparked a real change in newsrooms to become more diverse, to include more women, to include more people of color. I mean, I would say, the journalists that I work with and know today, it's far more diverse than it was when I worked in the Clinton administration, when I was at the DNC during the Obama years. And so that is a good thing, because I think there's an understanding. We all bring our lived experience to everything we do. Of course, being half Black impacted decisions we make. How could it not? But I think what he was trying to say was, I'm not looking at this decision through the lens of being a Black man. Because I can tell you the other thing I remember him talking about was, and I get the same thing, if you have a drop of Black blood in your body, you are Black in this country. And and we have trouble getting cabs, and it still happens. So of course we have those experiences, right? And I think the media had a hard time understanding that and didn't have the language all the time to understand how do you, and I think even Black journalists were struggling with, how do we talk about this in a way that gives people some insight into that experience, particularly knowing that as the first Black president, the pressure on him was, as any historic first, is very different. And the challenge was very different.
Right. So John, I think in things you've talked about, you probably agree with that point of view that the media was struggling on how to deal with this, but that in the process, you've made the criticism that we missed what was going on the other side, the level of extremism that was starting to rise up on the other side.
Exactly so. And, I agree with Karen that one of Obama's superpowers was to have a very broad understanding of the American experience by virtue of his upbringing. Just a quick story about when I first became acquainted with Barack Obama. It was in early 2004 when the Democratic primary was going on. And as somebody who's was covering presidential politics during a period when Republicans had a natural advantage and it was up to Democrats to try to figure out ways to make a national majority, you would watch people like Bill Clinton, who was exceptionally gifted as a politician, and say, that's somebody who could crack that code. In 2004, John Edwards was somebody that I was watching who was also very gifted. And his political consultant was a guy named David Axelrod. And I was talking to Axelrod one day in January of 2004, and I said, man, Edwards has really got something. He is a talented politician. He said, yeah, well, that's true, but I have to tell you, I've got somebody in Illinois who's coming up who's better than that. I said, who's that? He said, well, he's a state senator. I said, okay, and he's running for the U.S. Senate. Okay, what else? Well, he's a black guy. Oh, that's interesting. And his name is Barack Obama. And I said, get out of town. You cannot elect to statewide office a black guy named Barack Obama. Remember, this is after 9/11. And, Osama bin Laden and Barack Hussein Obama's middle name. Well, the fact is he was that gifted. And I met him a month later. This was before that convention speech, and I was blown away by his ability. And one aspect of his ability was he very aggressively did not play the race card. Karen was talking about Obama getting accused of playing the race card. That was a projection situation. He was not playing the race card. But race is the single most important shaping factor of our politics since the founding of the country. And it is the most important shaping factor in our political competition now. And a whole lot of, and I would argue that the preponderance of the backlash against Obama that resulted in the huge defeats in 2010, and which made it more difficult for him to operate thereafter, was not about the things that they were purportedly about, not about the budget, not about the health care bill. Those may have been aggravating factors, but at its core, there was a panic among certain segments of the population about the fact that had already been concerned that the country was changing in ways that they didn't like. Barack Obama personified those changes. And, why is it that Republicans' position in presidential competition has been so badly weakened over the last 20 years or so? Well, when Bill Clinton ran for president, 85% of the electorate was white. Well, now about 70% of the electorate is white. And that has been a fundamental reshaping of the contours of competition. And that is frightening to some people. In particular, white Christians, because the country's also becoming more secular. At the same time, we've had a social revolution that has raised the status and windows of opportunity for women. And so there are some people who find those changes threatening. And I think that produced the ferocious backlash to Obama, that underpinned the Trump movement and still does. And so I think one of the failures of the media was to appreciate that race was behind a turn of the Republican Party toward a kind of extremism that we're seeing now, we saw on January 6th. But the roots of that were in the Obama presidency, and that's something the country's going to have to deal with for a while now.
Kara, I know this is very much in line with, you subscribe to Ezra Klein's framing, which is similar to what John described, that the opposition that sort of started very quickly was less about policy, big government versus small government, globalism versus isolationism, and more about some Americans embracing the diversity and some fiercely antagonistic, opposed, and scared of it. And that I'm curious, from your perch at the Treasury Department, where you had to advocate for policy, did the media not get that? Were reporters not doing a good job of exposing that for what it was?
Well, I'm a professor, so I have to recommend a book here. But when I was at the Treasury, I sometimes felt that Ezra Klein, who was at the Washington Post, could describe what was happening in the economy better than I could. And he wrote this book, Why We're Polarized, which for me explains in simple terms so much of what's happening in this country. And he talks about how America's becoming more diverse, that's a fact, and some people embrace this and some people don't, and how that can ultimately explain the fundamental divides in our country. I think John's exactly right. All of us were a little slow to get our heads around it. And I think that when we talk about race in the Obama administration, we have to think not just about the fact that Obama was Black, biracial, but also how there was a movement coalescing to oppose him because it rejected these fundamental changes that were happening in our society, and sort of the Trump movement set itself in opposition to these changes that are underway, these demographic changes that are underway.
Could I just add one point? There's a reason that among the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, the iconography that you saw, things that people were carrying, some people were carrying crosses. Somebody was walking in the Capitol waving a Confederate flag. That's not an accident, because that's where the jet fuel for some of this resistance comes from. And that's more at what I would call the blue collar level, but you also see it in the elite level. And the example that I would offer is Bill Barr, who had been the Attorney General in the first Bush administration, that is H.W. Bush, and then became Trump's Attorney General. He ultimately bailed on Trump and was not willing to go as far as others in affirming false claims of a stolen election. But Bill Barr, after he was elected Attorney General, went to Notre Dame and gave a speech that encapsulated some of what I think we're talking about. And he said basically that conservative Christians were under assault by a huge force of the media, the entertainment system, academia, big corporations that were at war with traditional values. And he described it as a situation where they have to have a war in return. Now, he wasn't talking about a physical armed conflict, but the mindset that says, in response to the changes we're seeing in the country, that we are under attack is what produces the backlash that we're talking about, and that started during the Obama administration. And I think those of us in the media were slow to appreciate what that was. And it wasn't really until January 6th, when a bunch of reporters were running around the Capitol and felt it right up close, in fact, their own lives were in danger, that I think they got it. And I think they're starting to get it now in ways that they didn't before.
I just really want to quickly say, I want to correct something. African Americans experience what you all are talking about very differently. Not a single Black person I know thought that we were post-racial. And I heard a lot of white people saying that. And I would laugh and say, have you been to America? Have you met us? Because, and a lot of Black Americans experienced it very differently. There was a lot of fear that something would happen to him. There was a lot of understanding that particularly the coverage in the media, the way he had to present himself was very intentional around, to some degree, letting white people know it's okay. And that and that he cared about America and was keeping, all the issues on the table. Because again, in the right-wing media, it was, he's just going to do this for Black people. He's just going to, and so there was a real intentionality about that, that I think is important. And I also want to say, whereas I do think some of this crystallized under the Obama, we'd been talking about America becoming a majority minority country. When I was in high school, it's just that Obama reflected it's here. And we see very similar types of attacks with Kamala Harris, because she also looks like the future that there is fear around. And the last thing I'll say is, I think in terms of the media also, I worked on the 2016 Hillary campaign. They really blew it there too, because this right-wing movement that was galvanizing around Trump, we tried to talk about it a lot, and it just, it got kind of lost in the baggage around Hillary, I think. And I've had a number of reporters after the fact come back and apologize and say, wow, we missed this. So I do think, as we look back in terms of the coverage, and as John was saying, what are the strains that we missed? It tells us a lot about the country, where we are, where we're going. And again, I think the Obama presidency really helped to force some of these issues to the fore in a way we weren't ready to talk about.
So let me throw this out to anyone on the panel who wants to address it. There were, I think it's safe to say, two other things that really changed fairly dramatically during the course of the Obama presidency. There are many things, obviously. One was social media. MySpace was the top social media site when Barack Obama was elected. BlackBerries were the dominant mobile device. It was illegal. It was not allowed to connect to Facebook or Twitter on White House computers at the time. Obviously, that changed. And the other thing is the dramatic polarization of news media, which was dominantly broadcast at the beginning of the administration, became dominantly cable by the end, and MSNBC, CNN, Fox moved into their separate fact universes. I'm curious whether you think that's anything, Karen, the administration could have done anything about, and to the members of the press on the panel, and to Kara, is there anything that can be done about it even now?
I would say, well, I think we should acknowledge that one of the things that the Obama campaign and then the Obama White House did very well is to understand the importance of social media as an organizing tool, as a way to create a relationship with your supporters, with your donors. And then one of the things, though, that they struggled with in the White House is how do you maintain that authenticity? Because we know in social media, right, it's all about the authenticity. The tweets where it's like, here's our press release, don't tend to do as well as when you think it's part of why everybody follows Trump, right? Because it's entertaining. So I think they did a very good job of seeing it as a way to go around the media in some ways, but because, of Twitter and Facebook, those other outlets it was more the DNC that could do it, wasn't coming from within the White House in the same way. I don't think there's anything, I think MSNBC, which I ended up going to MSNBC partway through the Obama years, understood that one of the things that had happened during the campaign was more Black and brown people were interested in politics. So there was an audience. And I think MSNBC made a strategic decision to say, we're gonna follow that audience. We're gonna build to that audience. CNN at the time, I think, was trying to stay somewhere in the middle, and Fox, I think, took advantage of what we've been talking about. To my opinion, they've always been very much to the right, but really dug in on that and saw that opportunity as, again, these were financial opportunities, let's be honest. But we also then saw the proliferation in terms of radio, in terms of, you guys may not remember this, I'm going to say it, blogs. Right? At that time, blogs were still a big thing. And so I think it was definitely the beginning of where we were, self-selecting into our own silos and getting the information that was reaffirming our own bias.
Yeah. And I know for you traveled that whole journey from, right?
Night and day. The amazing thing about the Barack Obama timing, by the time he got to the White House, he was the very first American president who had the ability to reach all of the American people directly without being filtered through any media presentation because of the technological changes that started well before. But he's the first president who could or did tweet his opinions, his policies, his messages that went out not just to media that then reflected them, but went directly to the American people. And he got that BlackBerry. He was so proud of that BlackBerry. It was a BlackBerry, not an iPhone, because it could be encrypted. And he told me actually he uses it just to talk to his buddies back in Hawaii. He didn't do a lot with it, but he also institutionalized at the White House a channel of communications with Americans through the White House, whitehouse.gov website, where he and candidates had already been using this, but this was a president who could mount videos or explanations or send out to the entire American people the reasonings and the documentation of what he was doing. To me, the greatest offense by the Obama administration was that he had his own newscast on whitehouse.gov. It was the government website. It was called West Wing Week, and every Friday morning at about 10 o'clock, they mounted about a 5 or 6 minute newscast, which was at the time anchored by, voiceover by his deputy White House press secretary, Josh Earnest, who later became press secretary. And the president was also the first president who had his own, not only photographer, but videographer. He was followed behind the scenes all the time by a video camera. And they would take clips from these cute behind the scenes moments or their own perspective on things. And they would make up this every week, a 6 minute newscast. And amazingly, in that newscast, some of the harshest stories of the week never showed up. Can you imagine? But when he had a women's basketball, I forget whether it was collegiate or professional, come and shoot baskets with him at the White House, the press corps was not allowed to go cover that. But his video camera did. And the players later told us that what showed up on the air was him making 3 baskets in a row. They said, that was edited. So I think the use of modern technology really set President Obama in the forefront of what will now, has long since been common in candidates, but now presidents themselves can bypass that press filter.
Yeah. I would just add that I think any president of either party would have been wise to take advantage of the technology that Ann talked about. That is something that allowed them, unfiltered by anybody, whatever the media's ideology was. But it was also in part, in addition to that, a coping mechanism for them with the way in which the segmentation of media was working against them. I remember interviewing Obama about 6 months into his presidency, and I was asking a question because I had gotten a lot of this from viewers, CNBC viewers, that the coverage of Obama had been too soft because people were charmed by the guy. And there was some validity to that, but I was thinking from the standpoint of what we now call the mainstream media. I grew up in the mainstream media. My dad was a reporter and editor and columnist at the Washington Post, so that was my world, and it's where I came up as well. And I asked Obama about whether he thought his press coverage had been too easy, and he said, well, hold on a second. I've got one television network, one cable network that's entirely devoted to tearing me down. And he's talking about Fox, of course. And that drew a reaction from some of my colleagues, a negative reaction to what Obama did. People criticized Obama for singling out another network that may have had a different perspective. Now, from my point of view, when I watched what was going on the air at Fox, I thought he was right. I thought they were just wildly distorting things that he was doing and putting made-up stuff on television. It wasn't as vivid as the lies about the election, but it was pretty bad. And the reason that that had such an impact is when you look at the various constituencies that are elements of the coalitions of both political parties, the largest single one, even though Republicans are now a minority party in terms of national strength, the largest single group is white conservatives. With segmentations of various other minority groups and white people with different political beliefs. And so when you have that big of a mass of people that you're communicating with, you have a big impact on the political tone and temperature of the country. And, we saw in the settlement yesterday that Fox was held accountable for some of that stuff. It's worse now than it was then. But nevertheless, he was identifying something that was real. And it's, we talk about race and the issue of, Karen was talking about getting accused of playing the race card. You now have within the Republican Party a dominant view that the greatest discrimination that exists in American society is against white people. That view comes from, in part, the changes of the country, but in part that media bubble which communicates that constantly.
But I want to drill down on that a little bit and challenge us all. That, again, could we who were in the trenches then, could people in the journalistic trenches now do something about that? I mean, are we still, I think, Karen, you'd say we're still failing.
Yeah, I do. But look, here's what I think the challenge is. And when you're in the White House, you're under siege. Everything is unfair. I mean, there are moments when you say, well, that story at least turned out fair, right? And I remember talking to my friends who were in the administration and again, it's because you're working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So you feel under siege. And I will say, because of the nature of the right-wing media ecosystem, I mean, look at what happened to my colleague Van Jones. 2 weeks of unrelenting attacks were just, it became untenable. So I think that's part of what he was, speaking to and surfacing. At the same time, I think journalists have a challenge of how do we talk about these different cultural factors that are impacting how we view the policy and how it's being received, but also recognizing that that there is biased coverage and not being, think about the fact that during the Trump years, it took 3.5 years for a lot of news organizations to say something was a lie. And I would say there were some pretty clear lies from the very beginning. So I think that's the other place where the media can do a better job in terms of thinking through, yes, you want to be fair and report the news, but I do think at times people can get bullied into thinking it's too much one way or too much the other without, and I think it's a hard balance to find.
Kara, I wanted to ask you, you were, I think many in the rest of the panel were very focused on Barack Obama, the candidate, then the president, the personality. You were engaged at the Treasury Department specifically at a time when Europe was collapsing financially, and your priority was to sell a policy that wasn't necessarily popular. It was helping the Europeans as opposed to punishing these profligate people. And you've talked about the fact that the collective media portrayal of Obama as a celebrity, as a personality, actually made that a little tougher for you.
So I think, this is a kind of an uncomfortable situation, but I think that there was a sense in which media coverage in the time that I worked in the Treasury was something that could sometimes preclude good policy making. So I worked in the Treasury after the height of the US financial crisis, but during Europe's sovereign debt crisis. And I think it's fair to say in retrospect that within the administration, there were enormous fears that Europe's economy was going to tank and take the US economy down with it, just before, of course, the president's reelection campaign. And when I worked in the Treasury, my boss, Tim Geithner, used to joke that we in the US Treasury were Europe's finance ministry. Europe doesn't have a finance ministry. They really needed one. But that was even kind of a humble way of explaining things because we were the world's finance ministry. And we had Treasury staff all over the world teaching finance ministries basic things like how to keep track of how much revenue you collect, right? But in Europe in particular, their economy was on fire. And it was Tim Geithner, I do not exaggerate, who was drawing diagrams for heads of state explaining how a financial system functions and explaining why if you punish the profligate, whether it's banks or whether it's countries like Greece, your financial system is going to collapse. And so what needed to happen, just as in during the US financial crisis, of course, is to kind of do things that were very counterintuitive and unpopular in order to stabilize the economy, stabilize the financial system. And a big part of it was not punishing the people, and I don't mean individuals, I mean institutions, countries that caused these problems, because we couldn't afford for them to go down and take us down with them, right? And so, I thought it was interesting in the last panel, Congressman Israel talked about how, well, like Obama didn't really work members of Congress, right? And why wasn't I invited to watch baseball games at the White House with Obama, right? Because George W. Bush did that, he argued, I think, better, right? And I think there was this expectation, because Obama was so cool and so charismatic and so charming, that he was always going to be accessible to the media, that he was going to be this big media star. Certainly within my perch at Treasury, but I suspect more broadly, because Obama was so focused on policy and good policy, there was a sense in which media coverage was sometimes extraordinarily unhelpful to doing what needed to be done.
Can I just add, there was an interesting dynamic, because I remember very clearly during the campaign, news organizations sort of joked, put Obama on the cover. This is back when news magazines were actually a paper magazine. So I'm just going to take you back there for a minute.
And the Time cover actually was printed somewhere. Yeah.
Yes, the Time, right. But Time, I think, I don't remember the exact number, but a number of publications had him on their cover extraordinary amounts of time. I know the McCain campaign complained about it, and they were like, well, putting McCain on the cover doesn't sell the way that Obama does. But it was sort of interesting because there was so much curiosity and excitement about Obama in the campaign context. But then to what Kara's surfacing is, okay, but then when you're the president, you got to govern and you got to talk about policy. And it's not, and we were in a financial crisis. And so I do think there was also, these two will know better to say it differently than I, but I do think there was an expectation about, how available or what kind of Obama you were going to get in the White House that was different than the campaign, because in a campaign you want all that coverage because, that's...
Can I ask John a question? Why is it you had an interview with Barack Obama set up in the White House, 2 chairs facing each other? I don't remember a thing from your interview, but I remember what happened at the beginning of the interview, and I think it triggered a protest.
You want to tell that
animal
story?
rights.
There were two memorable things that happened when I interviewed Obama. The first was the one Ann's talking about. We were in the East Room of the White House, and there was a giant fly that had been circulating around the East Room before the interview, and some of the White House staff had legal pads and were trying to shoo the fly out of the room and then close the door, but it didn't work. And so while I'm talking to Obama, the fly starts buzzing around his face while he's talking. And he tried to ignore it for a while, and then at some point you just can't ignore it. And he started laughing, and he held his hand out, and the fly landed on his hand, and he killed it with what?
And by the way, the cameraman caught it on a close-up. It was brilliant.
It was like a Mr. Miyagi kind of movie. It's crazy.
And then they shot the corpse
I
of
hadn't
the fly.
even seen that
And
movie.
what did he say?
I learned it.
What did he say? Got the sucker.
Yeah, got the sucker. And then he
PETA,
moved it with his foot, and he pointed to Robert Gibbs, the press secretary, and said, "See that, Gibbs? Not bad." The other thing that happened, and this involved Ann's network, was a few months later, I went to interview Obama, and I had a daughter in high school, and I wanted to take her so she could have the experience of seeing this. And so she came. It was a Monday morning, and the night before, you may remember Taylor Swift had gotten some sort of music award, and Kanye went on the stage and grabbed the microphone from her, something like that. I didn't watch, but that's what happened. And while we were sitting there with robes on, getting made up by the makeup person, I said to the president, I said, were your girls as upset as my girls were that Kanye did that to Taylor Swift? And he looked at my daughter and said, Kanye's a jackass. and then he immediately was concerned that it was going to, create kind of a stir. It wasn't during the interview. It was during the run-up to the interview. But because at that time, if you did an interview like that, it went out on White House pool lines so that other people could see it. We weren't, I consider that off the record. We were just chit-chatting, before the event. But Ann's colleague, Terry Moran, was sitting in the White House booth, I think, and he saw it, and he immediately reported it. Obama calls Kanye West a jackass. And it created this huge public relations issue. And anyway.
Although it turned out to be prophetic.
Yeah, no kidding. No kidding.
I guess we got somebody else expressing a Kanye opinion.
Yeah,
exactly. But every network aired it except NBC because we had considered this an implicit off-the-record agreement. And so finally, it was getting so much airplay on CNN and other places, I went to Gibbs, the White House press secretary, and said, look, everybody else is running this. Can we have permission to be released from the off-the-record? And he said no. So we never did.
So I want to make sure our students, we're going to start with questions in the audience in just a few moments. I've just got a couple of other topics I want to get to. And Anne, I want to come back to you because I think one of the things that's absolutely true about coverage of presidencies is that presidencies in crisis are when you really see what's going on. You've been witness up close to some of those. One very famously, for the students who don't know, you were aboard Air Force One with George Bush on 9/11 on that incredible day. But I want you to talk about what you saw on a different day, and that was on December 14th, 2012 in Newtown, Connecticut. That's when 20 students, very young students and 6 adults were shot dead in a massacre. And 2 days later, you were with the president when he visited Newtown.
There were several times during the Obama administration, too many times, when there were crisis moments that had a very deep personal hit. And I don't think anything hit as hard as the day that we watched the news coverage coming in from Newtown, Connecticut. And I remember one of our reporters who was talking to people at the scene said, oh my God, it's children. We don't know how many, but it looks like it's children. President Obama went up to visit with the school community on that rainy Sunday night right after this happened. And we flew into Newark and we were driving to Connecticut and it was pouring rain. And he was going to meet, first of all, with the families individually, very appropriate. It was the kind of thing presidents do all too often, meeting with families of tragedy. And then he would come into the auditorium to address the families and the rest of the school community. And I really think at that moment, he would regard that as the worst moment of his presidency. Brings in the issue of guns. It brings in the issue of families. And I sat at the camera platform waiting for him to come out, and I was surrounded by dads who had their little children with them, brothers, sisters of the class that were so affected. And I noticed the parents never stopped, never took their hands off their kids, that the whole community was so deeply, deeply disturbed. And that was kind of a scarring moment for the administration, something that they were not able to do anything in the first term to prevent having happened, and something that he then deputized his Vice President Joe Biden to go out and lead an effort to bring in some additional gun legislation, gun safety legislation, they kept calling it. And I think that's still remembered, that milepost is what presidents so often have to juggle. A moment of crisis, a moment to appeal to the American people for help making change, And it's the kind of thing that got all Americans, I think,
Yeah.
really all on the same wavelength in terms of the pain of that moment.
You know, moments like that, though, as well, and I think I agree, that was one of the, and he's talked about what a hard moment that was, because at that time, it was shocking. It was, I think everyone we could not believe what we were seeing and hearing. But those moments also, you know, presidents are trying to decide how much of, you know, a little bit of his personality came out in the interview that John was talking about, which is one of the things, to some degrees, presidents are always trying to be mindful of how much and when's the right moment. But that's the kind of moment where also as a father, but as a president who had limited tools available to do something, that's what I remember, was just the frustration that he had. But, you know, to show your emotion and deciding how much is too much and when is the right moment. And he was very emotional when we heard from him as the country. And again, part of what made him, I mean, he was such a powerful orator, but we needed that. We needed that comforting. And he really rose to that occasion, because I remember thinking, what's he going to say? What can he say to make us feel better? And time after time, I mean, most presidents do, but he really did an incredible job in each of those moments, understanding what the pain was and how to speak to it. It was one of his gifts.
Sadly, I think I looked it up. I believe that was one of 15 times he spoke to the nation about it.
And I would just say, as a postscript, that moment also illustrates the turn toward extremism that I was talking about, because for all the emotion of that moment, for all the power of that moment, the slaughter of children in a school, he was unable to get Congress to do anything serious about it.
Let me, this is my last question, and then we're going to go to the audience, so please get your questions ready. I want to talk about a serious criticism of the Obama administration and get your takes on it, and that has to do with the subject of transparency and secrecy. President Obama was elected on a platform of open government and openness and transparency. But the overwhelming sentiment from reporters at the time was that this administration was not. Len Downey of the Washington Post wrote a very extensive critique, and Len was involved in Watergate coverage, said it was the most secretive administration since Nixon, that Obama's White House created an insider threat program to catch leakers, that they charged 6 people under the Espionage Act for leaking to the media, which was twice as many as had been charged in the 100-year history of the Espionage Act. Anybody on the panel, is that a fair criticism of that administration, that they were secretive, that they were anti-leak? Is that looking at the former Treasury official?
I will say that in my research in particular, one thing I have found is that the perspective of time can be very valuable here. So for instance, one of the programs we worked on when I was at Treasury was, terrorism financing. And I'll just say, this is a program that started under George W. Bush. And one of the things that really hampered the Obama administration in carrying out this program was the lack of secrecy, right? So the New York Times did an expose during the Bush administration to basically report that the US government was secretly obtaining data from SWIFT, this institution in Europe, on banking records. So it was the New York Times reporting on the George W. Bush administration. I actually spoke to Bush administration officials about this afterwards, and I learned that the way the Bush administration handled this was when they finally realized they couldn't convince the Times not to report on this, they leaked it to the Wall Street Journal. So the Wall Street Journal would get the New York Times scoop and run the story first. And this was such a crazy thing to do that George W. Bush personally had to sign off on it, from what I understand from former Treasury officials in that administration. Just fast forward a little bit, the New York Times has subsequently stated that they regret reporting on that and acknowledge that it really hampered efforts that were quite successful for some time after 9/11 in tracking down terrorists terrorists. And so I know I'm using an example from the previous administration, but I would just say that sometimes, I was someone with top secret security clearance, and sometimes there are legitimate reasons for why information is not disclosed. And even the New York Times has acknowledged that was hugely detrimental to the country's, national security. I would also say, and look, I'm a communication professor. I studied journalism. The press is very important in our society, right, to the functioning of democracy. So that should sort of go without saying. I will say that, being on the other side of this in the Obama administration, I spent a lot of time, for instance, every time we went into a G20, first question we'd start with when we started planning was, well, what's the shiny object to give reporters? And the thing about the G20 was we were in a situation where, we're all tied up in the world economy, right? And so one of the best things that we could do to strengthen the US economy is to not let China's economy go down and not let Europe's economy go down. And it was like one of those situations where even from a national security perspective, cooperation would be incredibly valuable, right? And we all know that domestic economic reform is incredibly unpopular and difficult. So it would be so much better for the US if we could just get the Europeans to handle their problems and the Chinese to handle their problems and then free ride the stronger global economy, right? But reporters didn't want to report on this. They needed a shiny object. They needed a currency war. They needed something, to put on the front page. And our big concern, of course, like what struck fear into the hearts of everyone in the Treasury Department was, an A1 headline the next day that the US is weak, that we lost at the G20, right? And so I remember, I'll just leave it with this, but going to the last G20 I went to with Tim Geithner, and Mexico was hosting it, and we traveled with the Secret Service, typically like on President Biden's plane or Secretary Clinton's plane, with the United States logo emblazoned, and that's how we arrived at G20s. Well, this was happening in Mexico City. We were sent with a CAT team, rifles, unmarked plane. That's how we walk into the place. And I remember Tim's joking, obviously, saying, perfect, a kidnapping, that's the shiny object, right? And so it's just the sense that, you have to sort of constantly perform, right? And that if someone wanted to take a much deeper look at what was happening below the surface and how we were trying to strengthen other economies and, the story there, it wouldn't have been as exciting. And so it wouldn't have been a story we could tell.
I sort of have a different take, which is, I'm aware of that criticism, and this is sort of a question for John. And to some degree, it's hard for me to tease out some of these criticisms from, and this happens, how journalists felt about the way they were treated by the current press team versus lack of transparency. So that's kind of one bucket, because we haven't talked about that, but that relationship is really critical. And there were some ups and downs during the Obama years with that as well. But the second thing is, I take the position normally that there are usually very good reasons. It's the press's job. Journalists, it's their job to push. And when you're on the other side, it's your job to figure out what can you say, what can you not say, and knowing that you may know 10 other things, that, in the example that you gave, that really could be jeopardized. And this is why I go back to the relationship. There has to be a relationship of trust at some point to be able to, a lot of times, as I always say this to young people who want to be press secretaries, your integrity is the number one thing you have. And when you lose it, you're no good. Nobody will hire Sean Spicer because he lost his integrity on day one. So, and that's my personal opinion, I'll say. So I do wonder with both of you how much you felt.
I'll ask for quick answers from both of you, and then anybody who wants to ask a question, please get to the microphones on either side, here and here.
I saw Barack Obama really pissed off only once in an off-the-record beer session on the patio out behind the White House Chief of Staff's office. Dennis McDonough had just taken over to be the Chief of Staff for President Obama in the last 2 years in the White House. And Dennis invited a handful of us who were there every day, about 6 o'clock in the evening, to come out onto this beautiful patio, which is just down the windows from the Oval Office, for some beer, cooler of beers and to talk about what the objectives were for the last 2 years of the Obama administration. And he said he'd just been in with the president, told him that he was going to meet with us. The French doors of the chief of staff's office open, and out onto the patio comes Barack Obama. And for 10 minutes, he berated us. This is the wires and the networks and the people who are there every day. All you report about is scandal. All you think the fact that we didn't clear some Tea Party IRS forms was a scandal. It wasn't a scandal. It was a bureaucratic mistake. We fixed it. You think that Benghazi, the death of 3 Americans, including the ambassador during in Benghazi, was a scandal. It wasn't. It was a terrible tragedy. And again, we've tried to make amends for that. He said, all you ever report is scandal. And he used 4-letter words repeatedly. All of us stood there stunned. Nobody had a notebook. Nobody was taking notes. And I later checked with some of my colleagues. I said, did you go write everything down? And do you remember that? He said, no, they say, I remember it the same way. And it shows that pent-up frustration from a man who also hosted us frequently for nice lunches, nice dinners. I had a private Jake Tapper and I had a private lunch with him in the president's dining room. He didn't resent the press. He appreciated the press and their role. But boy, you got to that 6-year mark, and he really, really just let off steam. And letting off steam's healthy.
Excellent. Great. Go ahead.
I would just say a couple things. First of all, on the 2 things that Ann mentioned, Benghazi and the IRS, Obama was right. And in fact, there was a long list of just complete bullshit scandals that were drummed up that is a reflection of the turn toward extremism that I was talking about before. On the secrecy question, in my experience, every White House is as secretive as possible because they think that is the best path to achieving their goals. So that is endemic to White Houses in general. 2, as Professor Nelson indicated in the previous panel, Democrats have long labored under the burden that they were weaker on national security. And so if you're a president who's dealing with national security leaks and you're a Democrat, you may feel more impetus toward demonstrating toughness on that than a Republican. And then the final thing I would say is simply that, what has been the biggest driver of national security concerns throughout my lifetime? It was the Cold War and the competition with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union lost the Cold War, broke up, but it's not entirely over. Russia and Vladimir Putin is trying to regain some of the lost luster and power of the Russians. And if you look at some of the things, the marquee national security leak issue of the Obama administration was Edward Snowden in those documents. It's not an accident, in my opinion, that Edward Snowden is in Russia right now. It's also not an accident that the Russian intelligence hacked and leaked the emails in 2016. And it's also not an accident that the leak that came out recently from this 21-year-old,
Air National.
Misbegotten young airman trying to brag to his friends, that was also with a pro-Russian tilt. And so if you believe the interests and the values of the United States are superior to those of Russia, and you value the U.S. role in the world, as I do, I think there's some reason to be concerned about the leaking of that information. And it's not, I don't consider Edward Snowden or that 21-year-old kid a whistleblower. I think it's something a lot worse than that.
All right. With that, thank you, John. Questions? Encourage our students to get up and... Go right ahead.
Hello, my name is Crystal Bermudez. I'm a senior journalism major with a minor in political science here at Hofstra. First I want to say thank you so much for taking the time and giving so much insight on this conversation. My first question was, some Hispanic publishers felt as though they were being ignored or taken for granted by the DNC and the Obama team. There were Latino publishers who represented more than 100 publications who couldn't afford to send reporters, went there firsthand to cover some of these events and felt like it was impossible to access credentials, or it was like they felt like they were left out. My question then is, how do we bridge the gap between, let's say, local publications who can reach more of those constituents who may not want to tune into bigger media corporations?
And it needs to be said that, as Crystal knows, local media is one of the few corners of media that still has a relationship of trust with its audience.
Yeah. Love local media, big fan. And actually, when I was at the DNC, we stopped calling Spanish language media specialty media, which is how it used to be called. I think there's two things. With regard to the White House, I will let my friends here talk about the White House Correspondents Association, how one gets credentials to cover the president. But I do think that their efforts actually are made when a vice president travels locally that is the opportunity to bring in local media with the understanding that they don't necessarily have someone in Washington. And I think this is another way also where technology has been, we used to do satellite media tours where it would give you the opportunity to talk to local television stations in media markets, even where you're not. I think it's gotten better, and again, I think that shifting the mindset from specialty to understanding that it's a way to engage and talk directly to a community, whether it's because the black press say the same thing, API papers say the same thing. So I think it's gotten better, but I agree with you. It's a problem, and it's not treated. Folks like the New York Times think they're more important because of their readership, when, like you said, in aggregate, actually, some of those papers have larger readership.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Peter Nicolino. I'm a third-year journalism student at the school. This is for any of the members of the panel to answer. In your opinion of the White House, what was the media's most significant misrepresentation or underreporting of the administration's policies or achievements?
So let me just repeat that question, which is, in your experience, any of you, what was the single greatest mistake or misrepresentation of what was reported about the White House? Is that correct?
Or underreporting.
Or underreported phenomenon during that time?
Good question. I have a quick one. The death of Trayvon Martin. I think the way the media handled that, when President Obama said, if I had a son, that's what he would look like, Trayvon. This goes back to my very original point. I don't think the media fully understood in that moment. And I remember having to explain to some people how much that was representative of a daily life experience in Black America and the availability of guns. And I think if you think, looking back now, I think we would have a very different perspective than how it was covered then and why it was so important that he make that comment when he did.
I would say one failure was the failure to appreciate and make clear the emptiness of some of this parade of fake scandals that were lobbed at the Obama administration. Benghazi, it was a tragedy. It wasn't a scandal. The same is true of the IRS thing. It was not how it was portrayed. There was another one early on in the administration. There was a woman named Shirley Sherrod who worked in the Department of Agriculture who was captured on an edited video clip appearing to, I forget exactly what she said, something about maybe favoring Black farmers over white farmers. Was that what it was? And it was just wrong. It was concocted to capitalize on the fear of white people of the Obama presidency and what changes that was going to bring. So I think that their death panels on healthcare was another one. There was a series of things, I think, that were treated as, oh, well, this is a real, what's one side or the other side? And it was, I think, not adequately depicted. The other thing, I think, is something that Professor Nelson referred to in the previous panel, which is the achievement of the administration. And it's not just the Obama administration. The Bush administration deserves credit for this as well. avoiding the Great Depression. When you had that moment that was described, that Congressman Israel described of Secretary Paulson, who was Bush's last Treasury Secretary, appealing to Democrats to come together with the Bush administration and save the economy from a complete collapse, which is an effort that began at the end of the Bush administration, continued in the Obama administration. That worked. And that was, we talk about polarization and how two parties can't do anything together. That was an example where people in both parties appreciated the gravity of what was happening at the highest level and actually saved the United States from a catastrophic outcome. And I think it's in the nature of things that, as Professor Nelson said, you don't write about the dog that didn't bark, but that was a big one.
Yeah.
Can I just add, this isn't an event, but one thing that I would have loved to see the media do more of is make clear when reporting on Obama and really other presidents as well, what they had it in their power to do. Karen mentioned guns. Here we are today, right? We talked about Newtown. Here we are today. According to a study last week, I say this as a mother, the #1 killer of children in the United States today is guns, right? And we talked about all of these episodes in the Obama administration. I think we have to think about what's in the president's power. And I say that because I trained as a political scientist, and we study in political science that Americans hold the president of the United States personally responsible for everything that goes wrong in their lives, regardless of whether they have the power to fix these things. I think that was particularly the case when we think back on race and other elements of the Obama presidency. I think that was particularly the case during the Obama administration. He was held personally accountable for every ill in your life. And if that's the case, then I think, media reporting could do a better job of explaining what power the president has and does not have in particular situations.
Excellent point.
That's a more important point than what I said.
Can we have one more question?
Just one more.
I was going to get to the question behind you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Luke. This goes to Ms. Compton and Mr. Harwood. So in recent years, journalism and reporting has been under attack. Can either of you talk about any experiences where you have felt such attacks, and has it ever impacted your reporting?
So the question is whether, if you've been attacked for your reporting, whether you've ever felt the effect of that attack. Is that right?
And had it impact your...
Had an impact on your reporting.
That particular moment of release when he was so critical, I don't think had an immediate effect. I will tell you, though, that the criticism I would bring down on his administration, because he had the technical ability to put out so much of his own material, the White House in the second term, probably the first 2 years of the second term, began to close down and keep the press out of certain meetings that he had during the week, during business hours. But he would take the video that he'd have of Jamie Dimon and all these New York financial titans coming to the White House, meeting with him in the Roosevelt Room. It was never on the president's schedule, but his own videographer was in there, and video and audio was certainly not a security, but they would take that video and they would put it on the administration would put it on the website under there. So I got the feeling on second term that there was more of a tendency to shield what the president did from press coverage far too often. It was a change from the first administration, and that's probably one of the greatest grudges I held when I departed the beat toward the end of his administration.
Yeah, I experienced a lot of backlash in a couple of occasions. The first was, and Luke will remember this well, in 2015, CNBC, which was a network I worked at, conducted a debate among Republican candidates in October of that year. That was, and to me, what we experienced in that was an illustration of exactly the turn toward extremism that I'm talking about. Donald Trump was the front runner. He was saying things that were just ridiculously untrue, that we all knew that they were untrue. I had faith that if you expose those things, that there would be an appreciation of people who were judging the candidates, that what was not true wasn't true, and they would look to look to someone who was saying things that were true. So I went very hard at Trump in this debate, in a little bit different way than some others had, because I used a little bit of mockery in the question I had, because I thought things that my colleagues had tried had not been so effective in exposing Trump. It didn't work, I will say. And it generated a tremendous backlash both within the room, the audience of the debate, and nationally among Republican voters. Tremendous anger. And it's a precursor of what we've seen since then from Trump and Trump's core supporters. That hurt my network because there was a subsequent debate that NBC was going to host that they canceled.
That was mine.
Yes, in response to that. Okay, so that was one, and that was really uncomfortable and difficult. The second, which was related to that, was when the Russian intelligence hacked the emails and released the emails of John Podesta. Some of those emails were mine. I'm not embarrassed about any of them because I say what I mean, and I don't say stuff in private that I don't say in public. But they were distorted in a grotesque way by the right-wing media bubble in ways that exacerbated that previous reaction to our debate. So things that were incredibly innocuous were portrayed as somehow part of a media plot or plot by me to help Hillary Clinton or whatever. It's complete crap. But it was uncomfortable, and it was uncomfortable for my bosses. And it was uncomfortable for me personally because a few weeks after that happened, my daughter's pictures were on neo-Nazi websites from Trump supporters who, were trying to heap opprobrium on people who were questioning them. That's okay. That wasn't okay. My kids being on the websites was not okay. But to me, yes, it made my bosses uncomfortable, but I've been doing this work long enough that if I don't call it the way I see it, why do the work? What's the point? And so I think the value add that I have had as a journalist at this point in my career is that I've seen enough that I have a fairly clear vision of what's going on, and I'm going to express that, and if that's difficult, so be it.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And with that, I'm sorry, I know we have one more question, but I do think we have to wrap up to keep things on schedule. I want to thank our excellent panel, Dr. Alaimo, and Karen and John. Thank you very much, everybody. Guys, pretty